It's the 28th of May. We go on with the work of Media Center Ukraine. My name is Svetlana Cheparenko, and we'll be speaking about global economic barriers and what we should be ready for after the end of the visa-free access with EU and the new tariff policy of the United States and how it can be reflected on Ukraine. Let me introduce our today's speakers. Those are Illia Neskhodovskyi, Ukrainian economist and director of the Institute of Social and Economic Transformation. Well, thank you for the correction. Unfortunately, we had a different piece of information. Mykhailo Nepran, first vice president of the Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, member of the Ukrainian Business Council, and Pavlo Martyshev, analyst at the Food and Land Use Research Center of Kyiv School of Economics. Hello. So let us begin the conversation with the end of the visa-free access, which is ending at the 8th of June. And the biggest part of the affected from its end will be in the agrarian sector. Pavlo, I think that you should be the one to speak, and your colleagues will join. We'd like to get to know what Ukrainian economy should be ready for, as well as Ukrainian agrarians in particular after the 5th of June. Thank you. Let us begin from the very beginning. Since 2016, when the deal about free trade with the EU was acting, we made a deal that in 5 years after we sign it, we'll review the quotas for the 5-year period for the agrarian products. And we did not do that because of the full-scale invasion start. In the beginning of the war, the European Union introduced preferences for the Ukrainian goods, the autonomous trade measures, those are the expanded quotas, and it helped, in fact, the increase of our export into the EU. That is, half of our agrarian sector was going to the EU countries. Now, these measures went on every year, and now we have the question how to review them and to roll back to the level, in fact, of the pre-war level, when instead of 7 bigger quotas, we'll have 30 smaller ones with the fees beyond the quotas, and it really restricts the export of our goods, in particular with the value added, which were processed. So we don't know what will happen after the 6th of June. What will be the format of the changes, because we can see the elections are ongoing in the European Union, and the Poland is the head, which is reflected definitely on the protectionism within the European market. We have 3 main options. First of all is the recovery of the autonomous trade modes, but it is not that likely. Secondly, it is much more probable we will stay and the indicators which used to be since 2016 till 2022. And it will be painful against our exporters, especially processors. And the third option is some hybrid model, maybe partial liberalization. And all of that is the part of our overall euro integration of the euro sector into the euro sector. It won't be that nice or pleasant. The analysts assess that those will be $3.5 billion for our exporters, but in fact, we'll look what will happen. What I need to mention that the statistics is on our side, because in the European import of good, the Ukrainian part is only 7%. Before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, it was 5%. Now we include several million of Ukrainians who moved to the European Union, and they increase the consumption of the products. So this statistics tells us that we are not that substantial as the player on the market of the European Union if we divide our import into the agrarian GDP of European Union, how much of agrarian products are produced in the EU, this ratio will be 2%. So to say we have only 2% of the European market. So can we create dumping? Well, I don't think so, but still, the Europeans think in the different way, and in some of the products they would like to introduce quotas. Thank you, Pavlo. Let me emphasize that we are joined online by Oleh Pendzin, the economist and executive director of the Economic Discussion Club. Hello, Oleg, and we will start the conversation about the end of the visa-free access to EU and how Ukraine should go on under new conditions. If you have any wish to add anything about any of the issues which we are conversing about, just raise a hand and we'll give you the floor. Okay, thank you. So maybe you have anything to add about the quotas, please. Well, it's not just about the quotas, but it was properly mentioned that we are not a competitor directly for the whole EU. But we need to understand that for some of the countries, in particular the ones which are neighboring ones, we are creating certain competitions. So they protested against that because the Ukrainian products turned out to be cheap, and it created competition within the country for their national producers altogether. But if we consider who in fact is the driver, or I would say who is pushing this process, that is definitely Poland. And the situation here is, again, we need to understand who will win, who will lose. The situation is the following. For instance, we have the trade with Poland. They have exported the products, or imported, looking at us, for $7 billion. And simultaneously, we exported the products for $4.7 billion. So the minus saldo is $2.3 million. And in some of the positions, I wouldn't say that this is the honest competition. They're actively delivering dairy products, but the price is lower than in Ukraine because Poland is one of the main dotations taker from the budget of the EU, which gives them the opportunity to keep the low price. Besides that, taking into account that our customs is not that perfect considering the corrupt flows, different smuggling and gray schemes, all of that gives the opportunity for the Poland to deliver the products by the not that wide schemes. As the outcome, their products, if you visit the border with Poland, you will see the whole shops or stores where they sell just Polish products. And it's not because they are working better, just because they don't pay VAT. And as a result, these products are cheaper and instantly replace the Ukrainian ones from the market. So we considered that we'll have certain losses, and we need a certain explanation for that. This is the turnover. It's not the revenue in the budget. It's not about, I would say, some revenue. It is the loss of the turnover, a possible loss of the turnover, because the quotas, for the understanding, does not mean that after this quota you cannot, in fact, deliver your products. You just need to pay the whole fee for that. And definitely, in 90% of the cases, it makes your products substantially less competitive because the fees are well thought through not to create internal competition. And altogether, still, some of those will be able to go on exporting their products to the EU, even with these fees. So coming back to this issue, I think as we raised the issue that we have the negative trade balance of $29 billion during the previous year. During the 4 months of 2025, the negative balance is $11.5 billion. So we have an awful disaster. What we export raw materials, agrarian raw materials, and metallurgy. Those are the two first positions which we export. Still, metallurgy is not always the ready product. We even reached the export of the ore. And as for me, this is the lowest point ever. What else can you export with the lowest value added, which you can just imagine, the ore? So in this key, we need to correct it. We very often have such a perception that someone is doing something against us. We need to protect the Ukrainian market. So considering that there are such positions, I'm sure that we need to review our system of fees and to protect a Ukrainian market from the overwhelming products which are competitive only because they have dotations. It's not fair competition when your competitor got dozens of billions of euro from the budget and you have under the shellings with the blackouts, with all of those issues and drafting, that is mobilization, and you still need to compete somehow. So I'd like to mention that the government during all of these times, in fact, just left our producers for good. They have a good situation because we are given the money, so the budget is getting funding from other sources. But for us, it's a disaster. What shall we have in the end of the war? Just a fully destroyed economy. So how can we compete? So even now we need to introduce certain steps to protect the market, in particular the agrarian products, to create better conditions for the Ukrainian producers, taking into consideration that we have limited access to the European market. Definitely this is the lawful step which has to be conducted by the government. Will it conduct it? It's an open question. Thank you, Oleh. Yes, let me tell you a couple of words. I fully agree with the colleagues. Maybe it's worth saying that in the revenue of the European farmer today, 60% is the dotations from Brussels. And when we say that today in Europe they created agrarian socialism, in fact it's true. When we compare, for instance, Polish farmership with Ukrainians, the average Polish farmership is 9 hectares. In Ukraine, 81 hectares. So the average, well, the lands are sandy in Poland. We have black land, that is Chornozem. The average agrarian salary is $1,500 per month. In Ukraine, it's much lower. I will not mention it even. So under these conditions, who is more competitive at the European market? Undoubtedly, the Ukrainian agrarian products, which by quality are not worse than the European ones. So Europe, European agrarians, and why Poland, in fact? In Poland, we have 3 million of farmerships. That's approximately 9.5 million of people, of the voters. Under the conditions of the constant political competitions which are now done in Poland, and we know that we have now, in fact, the presidential elections, the response of the Polish politicians to this or that position of the voter, of the agrarian, is totally understandable. But we are speaking about the Polish, but we have the French, who have the similar situation, and they are also the leading ones in the strict sanctions introduction against Ukrainian agrarians. We have Slovakia, we have Hungary. There are agrarian countries of the EU which have a very specific policy of the products of the prevention of the products of the countries who have better competitive opportunities. But we need to understand that our steadfast movement direction to the EU, our Euro integration, definitely will claim rather substantial negotiations processes with the European politicians, with Brussels, about the place of the Ukrainian agrarian market and Ukrainian agrarian products on the European market. When we are talking about one more point, we need to understand the following. We are now at the eve of very important negotiations of the EU with the US about the compromises on the issues of trade relations. What can the US offer for the European market now? Just liquefied gas and energy, and also the US are interested for their agrarian products, beef, grains, and definitely it's a very sensitive issue of access of these products to the European market. Let us be sincere and frank. It's very easy to block Ukrainian-Polish border with the Polish agrarians, but it's interesting how they will fight American products and what shall they block. Of course, it's a joke, but to be more serious, the issue of the presence of the agrarian or American products at the European market will make the negotiations process more complicated because of the Ukrainians, because definitely we are an incredibly competitive party. When we speak about how the situation has changed since 2022. Yes, since 2022, we are incredibly grateful to our European partners that they gave us the opportunity to Ukraine to find new ways of the promotion of our products to the world market, because for us, the Black Sea was closed then. And as of today, Ukraine has more or less stable logistics spheres about the Black Sea, through the territorial waters of our European partners. So coming back to the quarters of 2016-2021 is not that critical as it would be in 2022. But again, the issue of Ukrainian presence at the European premium agrarian market is the issue of our euro integration, and it's a very substantial challenge for our government officials to find compromise what is needed so that Ukraine could become the member of the EU in the full sense of this word. Thank you, Oleh. Mykhailo. Well, we need to come back to the grey building at Grushevsky Street 12/2. We used to work together with him in the Ministry of Economy. It was long before, but still. We need to move to the following question. You know, I have several ideas. I am observing the situation about the quotas. This is the second wave. The first one was in April, when there was the information about that. Now we have the second one. In April, it was more analytical. Now we have the second wave, and I would characterize it as the uniting of the opposition with huge agrarian exporters. There was the whole wave when I wrote a very limited or restricted idea. Some exporters pressed onto me. We are influencing the government, and you are so moderate. I can forecast that the third wave will be after the 6th of June, when everything will be working. Then the opposition will attack the government team. So, first point, any fee or any discount sooner or later should end. Because if the discount is not ending, it is becoming the rule. So it has to be legitimate. I agree with Oleh. We turn out to be competitive. It's paradox, but in our history, Stalin brought the farmers to the kolhosps, collective farms, but thanks to the industrial economic entities, economically we are exceeding the Polish and the French farmers in spite of the subsidies. But the third one, you said such a phrase which is becoming a refrain, that we are the victims. Who are the victims? Ukrainian economy did not get $3 billion, Financial Times say. I asked Oleh, the analytical platform, did it calculate the losses? What were the losses? Those were not the losses. Well, but we say that Ukrainian economy lost $3 billion, and Hetmansev, who doesn't like the economic bloc of the government, says we lost €3 billion. And I'm asking, who lost? Which economy? Let's look more specific. Our main agrarian exporters. Mr. Vereysky, Colonel, by the way, he's taking a very moderate position. He supported the actions of the government and said that the political contradictions with the EU shouldn't be more aggravated because they are the biggest sunflower oil exporters. But where is he registered? In Luxembourg. Where does the money, what economy gets the money? Of Ukraine or of Luxembourg? If we take the 5 main exporters, the Ukrainian ones are only 2. But still they are registered in Switzerland as the foreign economic company. So when we say that the economy of Ukraine did not get something or undergot something, I would say those are euphemisms. Those are nice phrases which are used by the politicians, and people are hating that. So this is still an open question. Who did not get anything? There are other markets where you can sell something, where we fall short. But I am worried about the different issue. When we start the financial expansion, when the exporters launch the enterprises in Europe, and they issue Spanish products, or one of the leaders who are dealing with chicken meat, they say that in the Balkans they will open a big enterprise. This is what makes me worried. The third point about the losses. I looked at that. That was the speech of Andrei Pyshny, the head of the National Bank, that the black and the gray schemes of the agrarian products were in the end of 2023. After that, no one said it's not true. $8 billion, so almost 3 times more than it was calculated before. So, last point. We're always speaking that export is cool. Of course it's cool. And we are the organization which serves the exporters. We are earning on that, and we are living thanks to that. By the way, I would like to talk with you about that as well. There was such a situation in the end of 2021 when the grain price was increasing and all the grain from Ukraine was given for the export. The price of grain was up to 9,000 per ton. And we did it together with the bakers. We wanted to warn because the price of the baked bread was just incredibly high. It was impossible to keep to those norms, and it's paradox, but 2022, when everything went down, the exports stopped, the price went down, it seems to me, to 2.5 thousand hryvnia. So it turns out that the export is not always good, or maybe I'm mistaken. Okay, let us still have this question open, and later we'll come back to that. In the end, we need to move on because we have limited time. I understand you. Thank you so much, but we are short of time. Still, you need to take the mic. Mykhailo, I heard you. We'll come back to that in the end. We have several more questions we need to discuss, and we are short of time, and I'm following that we have enough time. I'd like to move to the issue of the U.S., because Ukraine is not in the local storm of trade relations with the EU, but in the global storm, which was started by Trump and his office. And in fact, he totally reviewed all the world trade relations. Oleh already mentioned that there will be substantial negotiations between the US and the EU, especially about the agrarian products. So I'd like to tell how this new US tariff policy will be seen in Ukraine and how the changes of the global supply chains can influence Ukraine, the map of the trade and the prices. Oleh, could you please start if you were the first to mention this issue of the US? Well, look, when we are talking directly about our relations with the United States, I would just like to remind you that the United States, we are selling to the US for $800 million. We buy for more than $3 billion. And what we sell to the US, 500 million of that, is just the product of black metals, which as of today has about 25% customs limits, and it won't be lifted because there is a very specific position of Trump administration that those fees and tariffs should stay to incentivize the development of metallurgy in the US. So the overall volume of what we lose cooperating with the United States and with the customs limits is rather high. Our biggest trade partner is China. The United States are very far from that. But the issue is different. We are the raw materials country, and as we have customs issues which exist in the world, the price for the raw materials is going down. By the way, look at the example of the oil price. Before the introduction of tariffs by the US, about the world trade. The oil was at the level of $74 per barrel of Brent, now 66. So on the one hand, for us, it's good, because the revenues of Russian budgets are going down and they lose money, so they cannot fund the war. On the other hand, our income of our raw materials producers are going down. We were speaking about black metals, grain markets. Definitely we can see this decrease or fall. The issues which exist with the tariffs lead to the decrease of the prices at the world raw material markets. So at large, I would say that I agree with my colleagues when we speak about the structure of the Ukrainian export and the influence of the world financial processes onto Ukrainian export. We need to understand that we are the raw material focused country. We sell raw materials. We sell not that processed raw materials. And the issue of survival of Ukraine is the issue of the increased value added in the product which we sell. So the issues of the depth of processing is the issue of the survival of economy of Ukraine. So when, by the way, mind that the enterprises with a rather high level of processing and the high value added are not that affected by any financial perturbations or changes, because they have a very nice element of reliability of their activity. Unfortunately, the economy of Ukraine so far is not that substantial in that, and we don't see that those will be the changes in the structural peculiarities. Yes, there are hopes and expectations for the military-industrial complex. There is the hope that we could have new export-import relations. We are today the country with a negative trade balance with the economy of the world. And those are very serious challenges on how it can be changed. But again, let me repeat. The military-industrial complex of any country is the top of the industrial iceberg, the top of this industrial pyramid. As of today, our military-industrial complex, unfortunately, is the element of what is produced in other countries. We, in fact, don't have the base, the foundation, which could provide the substantial development of the military-industrial complex, so that it could become the foundation for the future export strategy of Ukraine. We need to add all of the Ukrainian industry. And when we speak about the agrarian sector, somehow we forget that for the future development of Ukraine, you need to consider not just the agrarian export as it is, but we need to consider the agrarian cluster for the development of Ukrainian economy. Because producing a huge amount of agrarian products, we have a huge demand at the internal market. So as for the agrarian equipment and agrarian chemicals, and as for the system for the protection of plants, they are needed to be produced in Ukraine because we have the demand. So the issue of the world trade will be not that worrying for us, because we will be much more stronger and much more stable within our own economic model. So again, when we are discussing that today Ukraine is at the sideways of the financial economic processes, and it in fact changes the it offsets the processes in the world for us. On the other hand, it's bad because as we are at the sideways, we are just the raw materials annex for bigger countries. We have the understanding how it can be changed. We understand what we need to do for that, but the main questions are the security issues. The main questions are the investment climate shifts in Ukraine. Without that, will be still raw materials annex. Illia, then the floor goes to you, as I had to stop you. I would like to get to know more about those chain processes. In fact, export and import with the US cannot be compared. But still, all of the changes which are now done by the Trump administration, to this or that extent, will influence the world prices, so the prices which Ukraine faces. Look, the issue of those trade wars is not just the issue for the change of the price. This is the change of the accessibility of certain markets. For instance, when China is at war, or the US is at war with China, they are closing the market for each other. For instance, let's take the Chinese market. We're saying we will lose with the United States a certain part of our, for instance, as for our pipes, we'll have 25% of the tariff. That's true. It won't be cancelled. But China introduces the same tariffs for the American products. And I would say we'll have the new market because the traditional buyer was China for us. So we need to do what we need to do. And we have the potential for that. For instance, we were speaking about the European Union, which closes the access in those volumes which we need in the agrarian products. But the main buyer was China, for instance, for corn. And in the corn market, we competed with the US at the Chinese market. And again, we had certain fees and tariffs, and the access is limited, so we have new opportunities. And it's not only about the corn, but some other types of grains. So in this case, we need to understand that it's not only the global shift. This is the whole reshifting of the players, the main change of the trade partners. And our objective is not to play with the price, but to take the niche of the market, to get to the market and to stay there at the market which will be free as the end of this trade war. Really, we are the raw material country, but just because of this policy of the government, we are a raw material country because of the such policy of the National Bank. We are the raw material country because of the Ministry of Finance, and in fact we have such a policy in the customs, so all of that needs to disproportions. As for the export, by the way, let me tell you a word. Export is good, but there is a detail. It depends on what you export. If you export the raw material, producing certain products, and you take the whole value added back, it's very bad. So you're in fact giving away what you could produce here, and then you are paying what they processed instead of giving the jobs here in Ukraine. So about that, about the price. I agree, limited markets lead to the decrease of the prices. That's true, but for that we need the government which produces the literate policy, and it can regulate those processes through the same export fees and tariffs. It can regulate those processes through certain quotas. And it is not using. Our problem is the insufficient, non-professional government, which is totally inactive in those processes. With the businesses, which is active, with the businesses who need to survive, but the government is holding all of that. The government is slowing down. Let us take the military-industrial complex. How can the military-industrial complex be developed when the export is closed? It cannot. Who will you sell to? You're taking something for several $1 million and then you supply that. It's not enough to have the real export. You need to open export, but you need to do that cleverly so that we could understand that the international partners are providing the military equipment for free. So we need to explain why we'll sell our products. As for competing, what we'll offer, it is remotely competing. For instance, electronic warfares and drones, UAVs. It's just the market where you can enter, and it's not an issue. Moreover, we can cooperate with other countries to produce these products. So as for that, how can we do that? I'm offering that and saying that the government is very slow. Let us introduce the export fees for the military products. They offer 20%. I would say 10% is enough. This is the margin business. They have the opportunity to pay such a fee. If you don't have such an opportunity, then sell it for Ukraine. If you don't have the opportunity to sell using the competitive price at the world markets. Altogether, it increases the volume. And again, let me emphasize, we have minus 29 billion, knowing that we've exported the products for 23 billion, 24 maybe even. So in other words, we have a huge negative balance. But the government is not working at all. Then an interesting point is about the US. What does the government offer? The government offers free trade. Well, let they look what are we buying from the United States. And those are cars, vehicles. First of all, if we take electric cars, they are not taxed. What's the kind of the free trade is that? And secondly, if you take a different vehicle, the American cars don't pay any fees and VAT and other taxes. How come? I don't understand this offer for the US. You need to fill up the budget and you don't want to take revenues. For me, it's incomprehensible. So, of course, for that, I think what is taking place here, the most important thing is professionalism and proactive position of the government. If it is actively analyzing the markets which have changed as a consequence of the trade wars and help our exporters to get to these markets, or at least not to interfere and to create certain conditions, then out of this trade war, we can even have the better outcome than we used to have before it started. Mykhailo, the floor is yours. I see you have something to say about the US relations. Okay, thank you. Well, you know, you're speaking about the US. What would take place? Well, let's start with something global and narrowing down to the specific. When Ukraine came to the World Labor Organization, in the ex-palace of the League of Nations, we have the WLO. What is this organization? It's the Trade UN, where 146 countries and 20 or 30 observers. And all of the contradictions which we had before were solved within this organization. There was an arbitrage there. I read the materials during the negotiations, how the US with Canada were fighting about wood. So all of that started not today. It always used to be. Everybody was fighting for himself or herself. We were pressed because they didn't want us to export the wood, and he doesn't like the UN, and we could not, in fact, export the timber and the roundwood. As for the World Trade Organization, we can lock their doors because all of the order which we had before was broken by the US, and the US is regulating now everything. They are providing how that should be done through the tariffs. So where is our place? I totally agree with Oleh. Thankfully, however it may seem paradox, we are in the sideways, and all of that is going without us. So will those wars really impact us? I am in doubts of that. As our third president said, how can it influence a little Ukrainian? It will not. At the level of the bigger exporters, at the level of Pinchuk with the export of his products, maybe he will make a deal. We shouldn't be worried about him. He has the resources and opportunities for that. The issue is the different one. I totally agree with you about the value added and the export, and as the head of one of the oldest business associations, I'm not happy when we are told that we took away 30 million tons of grain. I would say that we should take, for instance, noodles with the value added. But what's the issue? The government is to blame for that, definitely. I totally agree with that. But you know, there used to be such an interesting story. Before the war, we had a discussion with Danilo Hetmantsev when the government introduced export tariffs for the soy. And when they introduced this tariff for soy, they introduced it for a short period of time and then they cancelled it. And then I tell him, look, we are speaking about value added, the processing, that you needed to produce and process the products here. But why didn't you introduce it? Why did you cancel the tariff? And he said, we couldn't stand it, the pressure. On the one hand, we have the WTO, the partner countries, and the businesses. And what about 1998, when Kuchma introduced the tariff for the export of sunflower? It was also a colossal pressure against him and Ukraine, because the sunflower seed was all over the world from Russia, and everybody wanted to buy it. Nobody wanted to produce. So It's not that easy that the government doesn't want to do that. Hetmansev wanted to do that, but we couldn't stand it, and he had to confess in that. So, dear colleagues, when we are speaking about all of those processes, coming back to the United States, the topic which you provided, I think that it will not influence us at all, thankfully. And that's wonderful. Pavlo, let me come back to you. We need to move to the third and the last part, not to document the problems, but to solve the issues. That's why we are here today. We've spoken a lot about the value added, and it's about the agrarian sector as well, directly. How can we create a situation so that Ukraine could at least gradually start to refocus on such goods, and how, in fact, we should introduce the steps to find the alternative markets, alternative ways of trade, alternative ways out for the agrarians, so that we could stand in these complicated processes, in these awful processes which are going on in the world. I agree with Oleh that value added has to be interpreted in the broader sense of the word. The agrarian equipment is the value added. The seeds of the high-quality hybrids is already value added. And the products which seem to be a bit raw material, rather often they already have value added because of the increased characteristics of theirs. We should consider that what's the issue besides the value added? That the countries mostly protect themselves with the higher import tariffs when it's about the import of the processed goods. And in average, we had a research. An average tariff for the processed food products is 4 times higher than the raw materials. So they are trying to acquire raw materials and process it within. That's why we can see that during the last 20 years, the processing did not increase. If we don't look at the sunflower oil or maybe some confectionery, and that's it. It's hard to do that. It's not the fact that we'll be able to process soon the majority of the raw materials. We can see that such big producers, exporters as US and Brazil, export the raw materials, and it's a hard work to do. We need to find niche in the processing, like corn. Where do we process it? Either in bioethanol or starch, or do we give it to the cattle, and we have it as a result in the dairy products. So this is about the products. We need to test the markets where we have the margin, and we shouldn't distort the market signals so that the business understood where they can deliver to. As for the markets, we need to see that besides the European market, there is an increase of the Asian market, mostly India, which is forecasting a substantial demographic increase in comparison, in contrast with China, which will show the democratic pit. And what's also important in the Asian markets, it emerges the average class, which is capable of paying. They want to buy something else besides the grain. Africa is the same. In Africa, they have lower income still. So I would say those are mostly Asian markets. Thank you. Oleh, I'm coming to you. Let's expand the question from the agrarians to other markets, metallurgy, and also military-industrial complex, which you mentioned for more than once. How can Ukraine act not to lose its way at the world market? Let me add about the previous topic. Mykhailo was right to say, he mentioned about this painful topic. We need to understand that as of today, agrarian sector are not the enterprises which are registered in Ukraine. Those are big transnational corporations like Louis Dreyfus, the companies which came to the Ukrainian market long ago, and they have the totally specific specialization. They are not interested in the expansion of agrarian processing. Moreover, if we look on how we introduce the relations between such big transnational corporations and the Ukrainian farmers, look, the representative of the corporation is coming to the farmer, providing the seeds, providing the fuel, providing the equipment, and acquires whatever has been grown. So where do we have the opportunities for the Ukrainian farmers to begin and to invest substantial money into the agrarian processing? We need to understand that there should be a very specific position of the government on how you need to form the policy about the internal processing. And in fact, it's a very nice example, incredibly nice example, is the actions which were taken by the government on the sunflower seed and the development of the oil production in Ukraine, sunflower oil. If we can do that in other spheres of agrarian products, it would be perfect. As for others, high technology issues, look, when we are talking about the perspective of the recovery of Ukraine, we need to understand there should be a very specifically formed Ukrainian, it should be done by the government, Ukrainian policy on industrial development. Because as of today, we've lost a lot from the perspective of the Ukrainian industry. We'll definitely have the money so that we could get new technologies and so that we could develop what is needed for Ukraine. I already spoke about agrarian cluster. The issue of the military-industrial complex and the place of Ukraine in the future architecture of European security is incredibly important. And the issue about the place of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, first and foremost from the perspective of the provision of the European security architecture. Because the industrial complex itself, military one, is not working on its own. It is working within the ideology of security guarantees in the countries where we are now at. And our main customers, our main partners, first of all, will be the Europeans. And the third point, which is incredibly important, is the export policy of Ukraine. Really, when we are talking about the development of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, it should be done through the certain correspondent opportunities of the export of the products. We will not take the world markets if we do not help the export of Ukrainian military-industrial complex. So definitely, and I can be confident for 100%, we need to get through a very specific position of the Ukrainian government. Without its active policy, without its approaches at the world market, the help for the development of the Ukrainian export will not take place, and we won't have a certain agency which should credit the Ukrainian exporters. It was mentioned for so many times that there's no sense to repeat. We will always be the raw material country after that. Thank you, Oleh. Illia, as he mentioned you, could you add which first and foremost steps of the Ukrainian government should be to strengthen Ukrainians at the world arena? Well, you know, I was looking at the export strategy. We have it. In 2025, recently, just a couple of months ago. So the situation is so interesting. The government is showing such a vision. I think that so that our economy could be developing, a certain development should be done from bottom to the top. So the best way to earn the money is defined by the business itself. I'm constantly posing the question to the current governments, to the representatives and advisors. I'm always asking, could you please tell which priority branches did we have since 2016 when we started the increase, or 2015 till 2019? And they cannot list that. And we just had a huge growth of export. We had the growth of the revenue of the economy. It grew till the fourth quarter of 2019. And as for that, why did it take place? Because the main thing is not to define some branch and then from top to bottom to impose what the businesses have to do. You need to create the conditions. What are the conditions? The conditions are access to resources, the absence of regulatory obstacles or barriers, the way to the world markets. We have the decrease of the Economist because the government closed the opportunity for the international contacts. They are limited because the men are not allowed to leave the country. As an outcome, a huge number of contracts are not awarded because the person could not come and talk to the customer. And that's about the IT sphere and not only. So that we could have industrialization or post-industrialization, this issue brings us back to the tariffs and fees policies. First of all, we need to specifically protect our market. How can we protect the market? For so many years, we have a discussion why just the China bring a huge number of products through post office and so on. There is a certain initiative. Let us also tax them as any products. The Polish really are earning a lot. They are creating internet shops which are working for the Ukrainian audience directly. You're ordering from them. So why should Ukraine have such a store? It's better to create a store there, an internet store. They have huge warehouses. They sell it. You take it, and you don't pay any taxes. In particular, it's about VAT. So they compete. 20% is staying at theirs. And the government is turning a blind eye on that. It's okay for them. So we need to change the tariff policy. Definitely, it should be reviewed. We need to create the conditions not for a certain business, but altogether for the Ukrainian business, so that it could have access to resources, so that it could have the opportunity to produce products, so that it could have the opportunity to acquire raw materials and not to have the issues because of taxes. We have the 30 billion of VAT which was not returned, taken from the Ukrainian businesses. And the loans, Mr. Pyshny says 15%, such wonderful conditions for crediting. That's what he wrote yesterday. Well, sorry, who are they perfect for? For the banks or for the ones who are hardly surviving? And they cannot take such loans. Just look at that. And he says that crediting or loans are increasing. I don't see this increase. This is the policy of the National Bank, which needs to be adjusted as well so that we could achieve the economic growth. Because what is now done by the National Bank is killing the opportunities of the potential development of the country. Thank you, Illia. Mykhailo, you have the opportunity to conclude today's conversation. Together with Illia, he's a bad police officer, I am a good one, or vice versa. No, I'm not going to protect the National Bank. You know, still, my past of the work in the governmental structures make me more moderate. Because I understand that it's easier to criticize, but it's harder to take decisions and to respond. So first of all, I'd like to say that it's not that bad with the export. Recently, I was talking to Alexander Baldenyuk, Ukrainian Confectionery Association. He told me an interesting story, that Ukraine is taking the 3rd place in export of chocolate. We are competing with such monsters and giants like Belgium and Switzerland. And I read the statistical data that dairy producers export more butter. It's seasonal. It will depend on the weather conditions and how the dairy products will be produced in Europe. If there will be more milk, then it will be more. It's easier to give advice. And when you ask about the measures for business, let me tell you a story which shows, unfortunately, we are short of time. Oh, it's always like that. So, the first point. As it was told by organization of the meeting of the chamber with the head of the European Commission, do not interfere. Don't bother. And I support you in that. The businesses will find on their own where to export to. It's much more flexible. It's much more quick. And will find the opportunities to sell quicker. And secondly, from the perspective of the opportunities, of those restrictions which we have in the state is the support, starting with the Export Credit Agency, insurance, simplification of the procedures, promotion through the mutual certificates, veterinary and others. So within the opportunities, we need to create the conditions so that we could understand that there is no financial resource and everything spent for the war, but still we need to make it at the level of the procedures so that it could be simpler and more convenient. Thank you for such an interesting conversation. Let me remind you that we were speaking about the changes which the Ukraine should await after the end of the visa-free trade with the EU and new tariff policy of the US. In a couple of minutes, we'll go on and we'll be talking about the after-strikes against Ukrainian cities, the work of the rescuers, and the rules of safety for the citizens. Stay with us.